All right, is Catholicism dying? That is what we are talking about today. There was an article that was either sent to me or I read. I can't remember the exact situation that brought this about, but basically, there was this article published by a guy named Eric Sammons, who is
Mhm.
using some new recent Pew research, who is arguing that the Catholic numbers seem to be going down in the United States at a sort of alarming rate. I've got it in the title of this video. For every 100 Catholics that join the church, there are over 800, about 840, according to this Pew Research. 840 leave. So that seems bad, right? I mean, according to Eric
Salmons. Hmm.
Sammons. Yeah, he says, "I won't bury the lead. It's bad. It's really bad." According to this article. So let me just go ahead and start reading this, and we're going to get Jimmy Akin joining me again on Capturing Christianity. We're going to have him sort of interact with this, share his thoughts on what is actually going on, not just on a sort of microscopic level, which I guess it's not super microscopic, just honing in on the United States, but more globally, what's happening in the global church, the Catholic Church. Is this really bad? What should we think about this sort of information? Should this concern us? What sort of steps should we be taking to combat this? What else can we do as as Catholics? So, all right, let's move on to looking at some of this article and some of the claims that he's making here. Some of this is pretty shocking if you haven't heard this, if this is your first time. So only 19% of Americans self-identify as Catholic, down from 24% in 2007. Again, according to this new Pew research, this is a 20% decrease. By comparison, Protestants decreased by 21%, while religious nuns increased by 81% and Muslims increased an astounding 200%. So Muslims are doing really good in terms of numbers. They're going up as opposed to going down, although they still make up a very small percentage of the overall US population, only 1.2%. So I think that's going to be a big factor here in terms of like the Muslim demographics. But let's continue. Even though the Pew survey headline suggests that the decline in Christianity in this country may have leveled off, which is another thing maybe we'll talk about in a little bit, Jimmy, it's clear the overall direction is downward. Okay. So,
Yeah. So,
yeah, let's
so
pause there.
yeah. So, just a few things. So, you came into this story from a different trajectory than I did. I became aware a week or two ago of another story that had been published by Pew Research that I was asked to comment about in the press. And that is an article called, the headline is "Around the World, Many People Are Leaving Their Childhood Religions." And so that kind of makes it sound like this is a global trend. And so I've been focused until recently on that article. I had not been aware of the one by Eric Sammons. I know Eric. He's interviewed me. He's a good guy.
Hmm.
But I hadn't been aware of this article until you texted me a link to it shortly before the show. I think it's interesting, and I think he has a lot of good insights in it. Two thoughts just based on what you've read so far from this article, and we can also talk about the one that I've been more familiar with as well, if you wish. But the first thought is Pew acknowledges that the decline in Christianity in the United States has somewhat leveled off. Um, so it has declined more steeply in the past. And so even though the current numbers are not good, as Eric points out, it's not like we're on the top of a roller coaster hill and we're about to just plummet further. We've had some plummeted in the past, and it's more leveled off at this point. So, we may see some continued declines, but not at the same rate, is what I would pick up from that. Um, so that's my first thought. My second
Yeah.
is this is something that is evidenced of a broader cultural trend, because you'll note that Eric comments that Catholics in the relevant period have declined by 19%, but Protestants have decreased by 21%. So this is not something that affects Catholics exclusively. This is part of a broader cultural trend regarding Christianity in general in the United States. And so, one of the things that would be a mistake would be to look at situations in the Catholic Church specifically as if we and we alone are declining, which would root the problems more specifically in modern day Catholicism. It's not that. This is part of a broader cultural trend that's affecting other groups as well.
Yeah, I
That's
think
not
those
to
are fair
say
points.
that's not to say the Catholic Church isn't doing anything wrong or can't do things better. It's just to say this is not a problem that is unique to us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So just to clarify, the 20%, it was a 20% decrease in the Catholic demographic
Oh,
and a
sorry. Yeah.
21%. So very close, but
Yeah.
still, I just wanted to make sure we got the numbers right there. But then he says, okay, the numbers get worse for Catholics. And I mentioned this earlier. Perhaps the most stunning finding in the survey is that for every 100 people who join the Catholic Church, 840 leave. So when you rejoice seeing folks become Catholic at Easter, which you should, remember that more than
Yay.
8 people have left by the back door for each one who's come in to the front.
Mm-hmm.
So I was talking with a friend of mine about this, and he was mentioning like maybe what's going on is that the sort of how would you describe these people, Jimmy? People who are just sort of nominally, maybe a nominal Catholic, someone who's just sort of remotely interested. They go every few times a year. They're not really devoted. They don't really even, maybe not even think that Jesus is in the Eucharist. You know, these sorts of quote unquote Catholics, are these the ones who you think are leaving the church, or is it more people who are devoted and who have looked into the issues? And do you think that? I mean, it's hard to guess based on these numbers, but what would be your sort of intuition here on this?
Well, I think that these are, broadly speaking, not devout Catholics. These are not the people who go every week. The church, the survey would need to be more finer grained and would need to ask questions about like what was your attendance when you were Catholic versus, when you left. And these numbers are always fuzzy because they're self-reported, and people tend to adjust what they report to make themselves look good to the pollsters, especially if it's a human pollster, rather than just an impartial survey that could be conducted by an automatic mechanism. But taking the data for what it is, the people that are most likely to leave any communion are those who have a loose attachment to it. So when people who have identified as Catholic in the past stop identifying as Catholic, well, they were not exclusively, but overwhelmingly, those are going to be people who did not have a strong Catholic identity before. They likely were not going to church except maybe every so often, like Christmas and Easter or something. And the same thing is going to be true of the Protestants. Those would be Protestants who had a cultural identity as Protestant and may have been a member of a Protestant church at some point, but they weren't going every week either. These people are going to overwhelmingly be those who have a weak religious identity.
Yeah, I wonder, one of the reasons why I'm asking this question is because I wonder this distinction between devout and nominal Catholics. One thing to be concerned about here is sort of what's currently happening, right, in the total numbers. And we might think this is a really bad situation, people leaving the church, which it is. It's bad. We want more people in the church. But at the same time, there's a question about what is the future of the church going to look like? Okay, are these numbers going to continue this downward direction, or are they going to maybe even reverse course and go up? And so that's, I think, another interesting question. There was a video I was watching by, he's a relatively new Catholic YouTuber. I don't know if you've seen him yet. His name is Cameron, ironically. And I can't remember his last name off the top of my head. Not Bertuzzi, Cameron, some other Richter, something else. I think his last name starts with an R. Anyways, he made a video on a related topic, and his argument was that actually in the future, and say 20 or 30 years, we're actually going to see a sort of explosion in Catholic attendance because there's a lot more young people that are coming into the church, more devout young Catholics who are getting married, who are going to start to have children, who are going to raise their children to be devout Catholics. So we're actually going to see a sort of increase in the population in the future, whereas the same is not necessarily true for Protestants, because in
Mm.
general, Protestants have less children. They use contraception. They have less kids, and so for Catholics, though, the families tend to be bigger. You're going to have more people sort of entering the church this way, and so we're going to see a sort of flip in the future. Now, this is all speculative, right? We don't know exactly what's going to happen, but this was his argument. I wanted to get your take on it.
Well, I think it's a very interesting argument. He's sketching some plausible principles, but this is all data driven. I would have to see whether these factors that he's mentioning are just backed up anecdotally, or whether we have actual numbers supporting the idea that those who are becoming Catholic tend to be younger, and that at this point they tend to have families that are still larger than Protestant families. If those two assumptions are true, then that does speak well for the future. But I need to see the data on, are those assumptions true, or are they just anecdotal impressions?
Yeah, I think that's another fair point here. Let's move on to another part of the article here. He says, you might have noticed something peculiar about what I've shown you so far. If so many people are leaving the church, how is it that the total number has only dropped by 20%? Shouldn't it be a lot more? And he says, yes, there's something that keeps the numbers slightly afloat. Immigration. As the Pew Survey itself states, immigration has helped to bolster the number of Catholics in the United States. So while millions are fleeing the Catholic Church, new migrants keep the overall numbers from looking horrific. So I'm not saying our bishops are working so hard to keep mass immigration alive in this country to keep the true horrible state of the church hidden, but the inflow sure does end up having that effect.
Yeah, so I would agree with Eric there that I don't think the bishops are promoting open immigration policies because they want to hide the decline of Catholics in the country. I don't think that's their motive. I think that many of them sincerely believe in open immigration policies, and they've even been encouraged in that regard by folks in Rome. So I think a lot of them are sincerely of that opinion that we ought to have more open immigration policies than we do in this country. Also, there's a practical problem of, you have all these people showing up, whether they got here legally or not. They're Catholics, and if you don't provide pastoral care for them, A, that's a problem in and of itself, but B, they're going to go elsewhere. And so they'll lose Catholic identity and become, Protestant Pentecostals or things like that if you don't provide them pastoral care. So there's a need to provide pastoral care for the people who are showing up, regardless of how they got here. And so I think that the need to project "we're here for you," we want to help you nurture your Catholic identity. We're not going to rat you out to ICE or whatever. I think that's just a natural human reaction that bishops are going to have based on the need to care for people who've shown up and are ostensibly, now part of their flock.
All right, so let's just continue through some more of the article here, and then I want to get your thoughts. This may be a short stream today, but I just want to get your thoughts on the local numbers in the United States versus the global numbers. What is the overall picture that's actually being painted here? So, but let's look at this one. It's still related to the Pew survey that was mentioned earlier in the article. Let's run these numbers. 340 million Americans. 19% self-identify as Catholics, 64.6 million Catholics. 20% of those Catholics, 12.92 million practicing Catholics, or 3.8% of all Americans. Compare this number of practicing Catholics to the 98.6 million religious nuns. There are almost 8 times more religious nuns in America than practicing Catholics. And then remember, more than 50 million of the people who identify as Catholics don't even do the minimum to be considered practicing their faith in any real sense. Like I said, the news is bad, very bad. Any thoughts on that?
Well, you don't have any basis on which to challenge the numbers he gives. He does kind of make a recurring theme of this is bad, very bad, and
Mm.
I don't know that I fully agree with that. I agree it's bad, but I just don't know if it's as bad as he's perceiving it. I think there are also signs of hope. I'm also aware that these things fluctuate in the course of American history. People tend historically to be most enthused about their faith in America when they're facing competition from some other source. If you go back in American history and look at the time after the founding in the late 1700s, their church attendance rates, I mean, you might think, oh, well, people back then were so much more religious than they are today. And that's actually not true. Their church attendance rates were frequently lower than ours are today. And so you find these cultural trends happen in American history. And when people tend to be most enthusiastic for their own faith is when they're facing some kind of competition. And so we're currently in a phase where Christians have, a lot of them have gotten lax and have weak identities, and that's what's fueling the rise of the nuns. I always get confused by that because it sounds like NUN to me, the rise of
Yeah.
the nuns, but it's NONES. I think they need a better name for them. But what we're doing right now is we're fueling the opposition that will eventually re-stimulate Christians, both Catholic and Protestants, to be more enthusiastic and active in their faith. When people feel that they're under threat as Christians from some other source, that's when they get devout. Like if you look at the Middle East, it's a dominantly Muslim area, but you look at the Christians in the Middle East and wow, are they passionate about their Christian faith? Well, it's because they perceive their faith as being under threat. And the same thing's true here in America.
That's an interesting point.
Yeah. Also, so I think that there are self-correcting mechanisms that are built into this, and that's what causes these historical cycles. I even
so
think
we just
that
need to threaten the Catholics. We just threaten them.
Well, that's why they say the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. That's been the case all the way down through history. One thing that I think is worth pointing out is we may have actually turned a bit of a corner on this already. With the recent assault on Christian moral values, especially from Hollywood and television and things like that. They've won some people to their side, but they've also created a backlash, especially with the LGBTQIA plus rest of the alphabet group. That was becoming unavoidable in American culture. And there's been something of a repudiation of that. The current administration, for example, got elected in part because of pushback to that agenda, and now they've started enacting policies that are opposed to DEI and opposed to this kind of cultural revisionism that has become very much associated with one side of the political spectrum here in America, and that's created some pushback. And, even as of now, Hollywood is starting to produce movies. Now they've got a long pipeline. It takes, 2-3 years to make a movie. So there's a lot of crud that still needs to be pushed through the pipeline, but they've already started backing off on a lot of the extreme wokeness that we would see in movies. Those movies tend not to do as well as non-woke movies. And so I think even Hollywood is starting to learn this lesson that if you go woke, you go broke. And so I think that we may already be in a phase where things are starting to turn around. That's not to say they've turned around completely, but I think that we are in a situation where just culturally there are signs of optimism. Although, I mean, like some of the big Hollywood movies, just in the last year, we've learned about originally this movie was going to be more woke than it was. It was going to have trans characters and gay characters, and they decided to back off on some of that stuff. There's still a lot of junk in the pipeline, though. There's a show that I've been watching. It's a detective show, and especially in the second season of the show, it's like, okay, how many gay and trans characters do we need? Because it seems like they're introducing a new one every single week. And I've decided at the end of this season, I'm going to give up, because it's too much for me. It's getting in the way of the story too much. And I'm going to quit watching it unless they have some kind of course correction in the next season. But maybe they will. Maybe they're just pushing out the sludge that's currently in the pipeline, and they will have a correction, because a lot of places are correcting. The Bud Light fiasco that we saw where they
Yeah.
decided to adopt a trans influencer as their corporate spokesperson, led to a massive decline in sales of Bud Light, and that's now considered a classic textbook example of how to ruin your brand. So I think that there are course corrected mechanisms, and just because we've seen for a number of years this trend towards less and less Christian values, I don't think that we can just assume that trend's going to continue. I think it's likely to have a course correction.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to say in response to that. I think that there are
Mm-hmm.
very natural sort of guardrails that are going to prevent things from going completely off the rails. But I think it also underscores the importance of ministries like Capturing Christianity, like
Mm-hmm.
Trent Horn, like I mean, not just us, but Protestants. They're losing ground as well, according to this new research. And so, apologetics ministries, Mike Jones, Gavin Ortland, even Mike Winger, John McCrae, like all of these guys, we do need your support. I think you guys, if you're watching this and you find value in the content that we're producing, we do need your help. Like we operate, most of us anyway, we operate on donors. We operate on like our model is very heavily reliant on donations from people like you that are watching this right now and see value in the content that we're producing, the topics that we're discussing. So I want you guys to go to capturingchristianity.com/donate. If you in particular see value in the work that I'm doing here on Capturing Christianity, I need your help. Like I need you to go to Patreon today, right now, and support this ministry so that we can continue producing content. Got a lot more stuff planned, a lot more things to talk about, and we're like literally just getting started in this area, talking about Catholic or theology or these interrelated issues. Like we're just getting started in this, so I'm super excited about it. But we do need you guys to help support us to continue the work that we're doing. So let's do this. Jimmy, so
Actually, Eric makes a really good point in the paragraph that's bleeding up off the top. Could you back up a little bit and read that paragraph? Because I think Eric has a really good point there.
this one right here.
Yes.
So Catholics ignoring the problem is the biggest challenge, but there is another challenge, giving simplistic answers. There is no silver bullet that will reverse the decline. Just spreading the TLM, the trad silver bullet, or improving catechesis, the conservative silver bullet, or accepting modern sexual mores, the liberal silver bullet, won't solve the problem. There is no one answer for how to move forward.
And I agree with that. And I like the fact that Eric points out these proposals by different groups. People in the traditionalist community have said, oh, if you just let the traditional Latin Mass out of the cage, it'll reverse everything. And
Mm-hmm.
some conservatives will say, oh, if you just catechize people better, it'll reverse everything. Or if you just, liberals will say, if you just accept modern sexual mores, it'll reverse everything. And I think that none of those are true. I think that I'm all in favor of having the traditional Latin Mass widely available. I'm a big fan of that idea. I'm
Same.
also a big fan of improving catechesis, and it's already improved a lot compared to when I came into the church before the catechism was released. Catechesis today is night and day better, from my experience. I'm not so much a fan of the liberal just accept modern sexual mores silver bullet. But the first two I'm in favor of. But I agree that these will not solve the problem. We even have, in the case of the liberal silver bullet, we even have evidence of that because we have control cases in the Protestant community, because the mainline Protestant denominations, I'm not talking about the evangelicals, but the mainline Protestant denominations broadly have accepted modern sexual mores, and they are dying on the vine. They have not revived. I think that looking for a single thing that is going to cause a reversal of a major societal trend is a fool's quest. You're not going to find one magic bullet that's going to fix a larger societal trend like this is. One thing, and this is a related thought to our discussion, but for a long time, people in the traditional community have said, "Oh, when we went to having mass in the vernacular, that caused loads of people to quit their practice of their faith. They stopped going to church. They stopped going to mass, and that's what led to the decline in the Catholic Church. Now, my own thought on that is that, well, I'm sure it played a contributing factor, but we can actually test that. And I've never seen the numbers done on this. I've thought about doing them myself, but I just never have. But because we have a control case in the Protestant community, what everybody recognizes is that in the Catholic Church there was a decline in the 1960s, from beginning in 19. If you just bracket that decade, so you look at the period from 1960 to 1970, there is a decline in Catholic activity. But we can look, like, say, church attendance. But we can look at the same period and say, okay, what happened with Protestant church attendance in that same period? Did they see a similar decline? Now, when you have a major event in the life of the church, like Vatican II was, which occurred in the 1960s, not everyone's going to be pleased with that. Stuff's going to get unsettled, and it wouldn't surprise me at all that you would have a bump in the negative direction in Catholic activity following a major disruptive event like an ecumenical council. But we could answer the question, how much did that affect things, by looking at mass attendance as a proxy in both the Catholic community and the Protestant community, or I should say church attendance, since they don't have mass. And I've thought about going back and trying to dig up historical figures about church attendance in these two communities. Ideally, you'd want to do it not just in the United States, but also in Europe, and see, okay, what happened in these two communities. We know the Catholic Church had a decline, but the 1960s were pretty crazy for everybody. I wouldn't be at all surprised to find out that Protestants had a decline too, in which case you couldn't attribute the Catholic decline either to Vatican II and the change in the liturgy, or at least not exclusively to those things. Like if you found that the Protestant decline was only half of the Catholic decline, then you could say, okay, maybe half of the Catholic decline that the Protestant community didn't experience is because of the change in the liturgy or the Second Vatican Council or things like that. But I'm pretty sure that you're not going to be able to attribute all of the Catholic decline. I think that is another one of these broader societal trends, because it happened even in Protestant countries in Europe, which are much more secular now than they were in the mid-20th century. I think if you're actually looking for causation, World War II, which happened, 15 years before the 1960s, is likely one of the key factors that led to the decline of faith, especially in Europe. But
why do you think that?
Because it was so horrific, and it was so it was such a convulsion in the continental life of Europe, and you had millions and millions of people being killed, including the Jewish Holocaust, where all these people were just wiped out. It seemed like millions of them. It seemed like God was abandoning the world, and people in Europe, a lot of them decided, I just don't guess I'm a person of faith anymore.
Mm-hmm. Maybe we should go ahead and mention some of the... Well, you can finish your thought. I was just going to mention some of the factors that
okay, I'll mention it real. I'll mention it real quick. I've even seen it proposed that one of the reasons that Pope Pius XII decided to define the Assumption of Mary in 1950, 5 years after World War II, was in part to try to reinvigorate Catholic life after the horrific experience of going through the war. By giving someone a positive they could focus on.
I find all of this super fascinating because my story, maybe it's just unique in the sense of, like, I came from, a sort of devout Christian background, but a Protestant one. And so my introduction to the Catholic faith and coming into the church is, I think, a lot different than cradle Catholics and people that were just grown up in the faith. And they were very fortunate.
I'm from the same background.
They were very fortunate to be able to do that, but do think that it contributes to a sort of lackluster, or it can, maybe I should put it that way. It can contribute to a sort of, nominal type of faith. And so I literally can't even wrap my head around. A part of this is because my background in apologetics as well. Like, once I started to be confronted with objections to Christianity, I was like, okay, I need to figure out what's going on here. Like, if this is true, this is one of the most important things we can try to figure out in our lives. And I just can't identify with someone who takes it not who's nominal about this. Like, it's either true, it's all true, or it's not. You've got to figure this out. Super important. And so I just can't, like, I don't know. Maybe feel free to share thoughts on that or not, or we can move on. But I just can't identify with people who are nominal about this stuff.
Well, I sympathize with your line of reasoning because I come from a similar background. I was a devout evangelical, and then I became a devout Catholic. And I tend to approach things from a very analytical point of view and a very truth-oriented point of view. So, like, when I was in the process of becoming Catholic, some people would ask me questions like, "Do you feel God is calling you to be a Catholic?" And it's like, no, I'm not focusing on, do I have a special calling from God to become Catholic, as if it were an option. If Catholicism is true, then I need to be a Catholic, and if Catholicism is not true, then I need to not be a Catholic. So I wasn't do you feel God is calling you in this direction came across to me as a kind of touchy-feely surrogate for what people ought to be doing, which is figuring out what's true. But I'm coming at this from an apologist perspective, and so that's how I think. I have learned over time to have appreciation for people who are coming from different perspectives, though, because frankly, people like you and me who proceed from this analytical, truth-focused, self cross-examining perspective are really in the minority. We are the
Yeah.
oddballs. And so I've made a study of how do most people, whether they're Catholic or Protestant or whatever, how do they think about these things and what motivates them?
Yeah. Those are some good points. Let's turn now to talk about the global statistics. What do you have
Okay.
for us in this regard? What are we looking at in terms of the global population of Catholics? Is it declining? Is it level? Is it growing? Where are we at?
Okay, so the first thing I'd note, like I said, there was this article that came out on the pewresearch.org website. It's called Around the World, Many People Are Leaving Their Childhood Religions. And the subhead is Surveys in 36 countries find that Christianity and Buddhism have the biggest losses from religious switching, which they basically mean conversion by. Now, given that headline, you would think around the world, many people are leaving their childhood religions. Oh, that's like some kind of global trend. But then when you read the subhead, surveys in 36 countries find this. But there are about 200 countries in the world. And if you've only surveyed 36 of them, you may not have a representative sample of the global population. So you may not be giving us a trend that's generalizable to the whole world. And if you see where they've got that how we did this as the first kind of major subhead there, click on that. These countries in green are the ones that they surveyed. So notice we've got enormous chunks of Africa and Asia and the Middle East and Russia that they just did not survey. And so they're focusing, and if you look at where most of the countries that they did survey are, there are some exceptions, but most of them are North America and Europe. And we
Mm-hmm.
already know that North America and especially Europe has a secularizing trend. So of course you're going to find religious switching there. You will find religious switching in Africa, for example, and in East Asia, but there it's in the other direction of not people becoming secular, but people becoming Christian. And so I think you kind of have to, while this article from Pew Research may have some interesting factoids in it about different countries, it is not a scientific study of global religious trends. And if you want global religious trends, you're going to have to look at other statistics. And when you do that, the situation for Catholicism is not bleak in the way that this particular article would make it look. In fact, Catholicism is growing in the world. Year over year, there are more Catholics now, actually, than there have ever been. And the Catholic population of the world has been growing every year. And it's what's especially significant. Now, you could say, well, that's not impressive because the global population itself is in a growth phase right now. So the world population is growing, and Catholicism might still be on the decline if it's growing slower than the global population rate, but it ain't. In fact, the Catholic population of the world is growing faster than the global population rate itself. So it's like if you had 100 new, these are simplified numbers, but if you had 100 new people born in one year, there would be 101 Catholics born or something like that. It's growing, the Catholic population is growing slightly faster than the global average. So actually, things are looking up. Now, in the first article we looked at by Eric Sammons, he was focused on the United States. And there are problems in the United States. Oh, yeah. But we shouldn't let those overwhelm us. That tells us we've got a local problem we need to work on. And I agree with Eric, there's not a magic bullet because it's part of a societal trend in the United States. But when you look at the situation globally, things are actually much more positive for the Catholic faith. We're actually ahead of world population growth and our own growth.
Yeah, that is comforting in a sense. I do wonder what is the overall percentage. Going back to one of the things we talked about earlier was this difference between nominal and practicing Catholics. What I wonder what the total numbers are here. And then there might be an even deeper question, which we don't necessarily have to get into, is as to whether or not these people are actually Catholic. Like, do nominal Catholics actually qualify as real Catholics? Is there a distinction that we can make here? Again, we don't have to get into this in the stream. It's not necessarily the point to get into these sort of
that's an easy
tertiary.
One,
okay, what is it? What's the answer?
Well, if someone is baptized and was either baptized or received into the Catholic Church, and they still maintain a Catholic identity, they'll say, I am a Catholic if you ask them, then they're a Catholic. They may not be a good Catholic, but they're a Catholic.
All right. Fair enough. Let's go ahead and start wrapping things up. Like I said, this is going to be a relatively short stream for us today. Just talking about the overall numbers and giving you guys a little bit more perspective to think about. Is there anything that we haven't yet touched on that you wanted to touch on before we close up?
Those are the major points. I didn't know if you wanted to take listener questions or not, but I'm fine either way.
Yeah, I haven't seen any questions come in, so we might as well just go ahead and wrap things up. I really do appreciate you guys tuning in today. As I say, there are some really exciting things going on in the background for Capturing Christianity. I am actually going to attend a conference this week that I will be informing you guys about in the near future and tell you about my experience when I go. It's going to be really, really interesting. So I'll share more about that coming up soon. And I really appreciate you guys tuning in. We'll see you in the next Capturing Christianity video. See you guys later.